Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Dark Stories for the Dead of Night, Volume 3, Story Number 1. It happened 32 years ago. I was 16. We had just moved to Cherry Street in Mesa, Arizona. I was exhausted from moving furniture into our new home, which was an old adobe-style house probably built in the 20s. I remember being glad that I finally had my own room and even an outside door, which to me meant that I could come and go as I pleased. But that first evening in our new home, I wasn't going anywhere. I was too tired from the move. I fell asleep almost immediately. Later that evening, I felt something crawl on me. A bug, I thought, and began swatting at it. With spidery quickness, it tickled its way over every inch of my body. I smacked at it repeatedly. After I had slapped myself totally awake, the spidery sensation stopped. I peeked over my pillow and saw the alarm clock. To the very minute and second, it was 12 o'clock straight up. My head began turning of its own will, directing my eyes toward the hallway. I sensed something moving in the room. The presence of a being was walking toward me, yet there was nothing there. My eyes followed its essence until it stopped at the foot of my bed. My head again turned toward the hallway and followed another presence as it moved to the end of my bed and occupied a place next to the first visitor. This happened 5 times until my bed was surrounded by these invisible beings. Suddenly, a loud thump, like a pounding fist, struck the outside door in the bedroom. I jumped up without thinking and snatched the door open quickly to find that no one was there, not even a rock that might have been thrown at the door. I spent the rest of the night trying to sleep on 2 chairs in my brother's bedroom. The next morning, I wondered if I hadn't imagined everything. Maybe the spidery awakening was just nerves. Perhaps I mistook the sound of a contracting roof beam for a knock on the door. It would make living in the new house a lot easier if I could convince myself that I somehow misinterpreted everything that had happened. But then Wayne showed up for breakfast. Without me saying a word to him, he began telling me what happened to him the night before. He lived across the street and rented a room from an elderly lady. Only the 2 of them lived in the house. He said that at exactly 1 o'clock he felt something crawling all over him, and that was followed by a loud crash on his bedroom door, which was an inside door. He jumped out of bed and opened his door at about the same time that his landlady opened her door. They were both startled, but she seemed to have an understanding of the situation. She told him that sometimes odd things happened on Cherry Street. She said that once the doorknob to the front door was turning back and forth as if someone was trying to get in. Because the door entryway was recessed into the house, she could look out a window to see if anyone was at the front door. In this instance, there was no one outside, yet the door handle twisted back and forth as if something or someone was trying to enter. When Wayne told me his story, I was stunned, and glad that he told me his story first. Had I told him what happened to me, and then for him to say, "Oh yeah, that happened to me too," would have made me wonder. As it is, his memory of the event after all these years seems to have faded, while the event has always been vivid in memory and every detail. I don't know that any of it has any significance of any sort other than the fact that Cherry Street in Mesa, Arizona has, or did have, ghosts. Story number 2. In the early to mid-'80s, my family moved into a townhouse located in Hialeah, Florida, which happens to be a modern city. The townhouse had 3 floors, and most of the occurrences happened on the 2nd and 3rd. My room was located on the 2nd floor, but my playroom was on the 3rd. As a young kid, about 5 or 6, I used to talk to what I think was a spirit. At first I wasn't frightened, and had a weird communication with it. I remember the ghost being a tall blonde woman. Much of the conversation we had I truly don't remember. Soon after, my older brother and girlfriend brought a Ouija board to the house. I, being extremely afraid, never played with it or was even present in the same room. But something happened and things started getting weird. I never went into my playroom again because I felt I was being watched, and I became terrified. The room was rather small and it had a balcony. Even though warm summers, this room was always cold. This was the room they played with the Ouija board in. In the middle of the night, you could often hear strange noises coming from the room, like muffled voices, moving furniture, and loud footsteps. During this period, electrical objects would turn on and off on their own, like the ceiling fan in my room would turn on, and my radio would switch stations. I began to sleep with my parents due to the weird occurrences. I believe the house began to bring my family bad luck because my father's thriving business went down. We were sick more than ever, and our personalities changed. I recently found out that the original owner was a santero, Spanish for someone into witchcraft. Also, most of the families that moved in have had somewhat similar experiences with the bad luck. But I don't know about the spirits or noises. To this day, my family and I still have nightmares about going back. In the nightmares, we always end up getting trapped and not being able to escape. My family doesn't talk about their experiences. They don't like to, so I don't know how it was for them. Story number 3. After having left the military, I moved in with some friends back in my hometown of Pellicer. Pellicer is an old mining town with a rich history to boot. The house that I moved into is an old historical landmark dating back to the 1800s that is even listed in the town's tour guide. Strange occurrences have been known to happen in the old house that I was living in. For the most part, neither the history nor the occurrences bothered me. In fact, I found the strange occurrences to be rather odd and fascinating. That old house on Pleasant Street sure did have an interesting story. Originally, the house served as an inn for stagecoach travelers who would use Pellicer as a temporary stop. There used to be an old schoolhouse on a hill in the back of the house. Well, history says that the old schoolmaster went insane one day. He locked the children in the schoolhouse and burned it to the ground. Years after the event, the wood that survived the fire was used to build the second story of the old house on Pleasant Street. It is said that the spirits of the murdered children reside in the attic of the house, since both it and the second story was built with the wood from the old schoolhouse. Legend has it that spirit activity increases in the house as you approach the date that the school children were killed. From what I witnessed, it's true. Prior residents of that house have left the residence because they were frightened off by the strange occurrences in that house. It's said if a family moves into that house, and if that family has children, then the parents had best be civilized to the kids. A man who had raised a hard hand upon one of his small kids was almost killed by a falling chandelier, only after having watched the screws mysteriously fall out one by one. I had the good fortune, if one can say that it was good, of living in a room on the second floor of that house. On top of that, the access door to the attic was located in my bedroom. Quite often, I would feel as though I was not alone. It felt as though it were an inquisitive presence, much in the way little children may act around a grown-up who is doing something interesting. When I came into contact with these presences, in no way did I ever feel threatened. In fact, I felt both inquisitive and relaxed. One woman who lived in the house, Val, would not go up the small and rather cramped stairwell to the second floor. Just being on the steps to the second floor would always make her feel uneasy. Another woman, who lived on the first floor of the house, would not go into the basement because it would evoke feelings of terror in her. Both women said they would not even approach the second floor because they could hear things move around upstairs, when at times the second floor would be unoccupied. One really vivid experience that I had with these spirits came a little bit before Halloween. I was the only one at home that day, and there was not the slightest breeze blowing. I was suddenly awakened in my bedroom by the sound of the porch door suddenly swinging open and then slamming shut. Then I could hear the footsteps of a little child running across the living room floor. When the footsteps came to the stairwell, they stopped. I almost thought that Val and her kids were home, but then I remembered that the whole family went out of town for the day. Suddenly the footsteps resumed and slowly started to ascend the staircase. Upon reaching the top, the footsteps stopped again. Slowly getting up from my bed, I walked over to my door and opened it. Nothing. The stairwell was slightly chilly, but apart from that, nothing. I shut the door, turned, and went back to my bed. Just about then, I felt a slight breeze flow through the room as though it was heading for the attic door in the corner. Another vivid experience happened on Halloween Eve. I was feeling in the mood for a ghost, so I turned out the lights and, after lighting a few candles, decided that I would invite the spirits of the children to come out of the attic. Sitting in a comfortable chair, I started to practice a few relaxation and meditation exercises that would help to open myself up for spirit contact. After about 20 minutes or so, I began to feel the presence of small children. Although both the door and the window were closed, the room's temperature began to drop, and a slight breeze started to circulate around the room. I was not in the least bit frightened, and I felt as if the spirits of the little children were just as inquisitive as I was. After this went on for a little while, I thanked the spirits for coming, got up, turned on the lights, and blew out the candles. Even after the session had ended, the spiritual presence stayed strong in that room for about 5 or 10 minutes. And thinking back, I guess I was lucky that the only ghosts that showed up were those of little children. Next story. Once my sister and I were scaring each other with ghost stories. My father, a very practical and down-to-earth kind of guy, had been listening, and to our surprise, said he had actually experienced a close encounter with the unknown. According to him, it occurred when he was very young, during the early part of this century. My father lived in a small rural town in Texas. At that time, communities were spread many miles from the actual town. Roads were very narrow and deserted. My grandfather would take my father to the city jail to show him what might happen if he should decide to break the law. On their trips, my father would meet many characters. Most of the inmates were harmless drunkards or trespassers. Yet on one trip they found a familiar face. His uncle had newly arrived after murdering an acquaintance of his. The policeman on duty said that his uncle Sam had had an altercation with the victim after losing a poker game. Both had been very intoxicated. Uncle Sam believed himself to have been cheated in the game. Supposedly Uncle Sam had laid in wait on a deserted road to even the matter with the other man and get his lost money. He surprised the man, struggled with him, and killed him. In his anger, Uncle Sam severed the man's head, then fled. The next day, guilt-stricken, Uncle Sam confessed, and the police went in search of the remains. They found the body, but not the head. After searching, they found that buzzards had apparently dragged the head several yards from the original spot. Uncle Sam had apparently gone insane, screaming in his jail cell about the ghost of the dead man. He said that the ghost was haunting him and wanted to be set free. A day after their visit to the jail, my father learned that Uncle Sam had hung himself from the ceiling of the cell. This isn't so frightening as what happened next. At the first of the month, my father and grandfather traveled to town to purchase supplies for my grandfather's farm. My father and grandfather were returning home from town very tired. It was late at night. At the time, most people still traveled by wagon, and a short trip for us usually took them many hours. The road to my grandfather's house was the same one which Uncle Sam had killed the victim on. It was very dark, and the only light was that which was given off by a lantern, which was held by my father. At one point, my father stated that a vague white apparition floated out of the brush on the side of the road and seemed to pass underneath the horses. The horses became nervous and began to move in quick motions back, up, and forth. Grandfather wrestled the reins for controls of the horse. My father watched as the white ghost floated from beneath the horses to the other side of the road and disappeared. This, of course, occurred in a mere few seconds. Then the horses calmed, and the two were continuing their journey. My grandfather believed it to be a small animal, and didn't think any more of it. Yet, on one of their later visits to the jail, my grandfather told a story to one of the policemen. The policeman seemed surprised and stated that the very spot where my grandfather had had so much trouble with the horses was the same spot where the police had found the victim's head. Next story. I lived in a town of about 800 people, which I hated, so I got into the habit of exploring the countryside and seeing where the roads lead to. I was driving with my windows down and the stereo pounding at the usual level of a 20-year-old. I turned a corner and started thinking to myself how beautiful this road was. The trees closed over the road, just like in those old English movies. This is hard to explain, but in my mind I suddenly heard a woman scream. I jumped. That is how loud it was. I got the sudden impression that someone was trying to catch my car. I was only going about 10 miles per hour on foot, and someone behind them was trying to warn me. I felt that whatever was chasing me was getting closer. I floored down the little gravel road that I was on, skidded around the other corner, and felt like I just barely got away from it. I felt myself starting to get tunnel vision that you get before you pass out. I was terrified enough to make my mind shut down. I had always wanted to see a ghost just to prove that it exists. I had held private seances trying to contact spirits and such, and had never been scared of the supernatural by any means. I somehow felt that, however, whatever was chasing me was very evil, angry, and wouldn't let me leave alive. I shivered and shook for days, but when I finally calmed down enough, I explained to my mother how to get there and the look of the road, and said, "That was a beautiful place. Do you know the name of the road?" She said that she didn't, but told me to ask my grandmother since she used to live in that area. My grandmother was asked. She told me the name of the road, and also said this: "Strange that you should ask about that road. We used to live right down the street from that area, but we had to move." "Why?" I asked. "Just a painful memory. There was a woman that was brought to that area by her new boyfriend. He parked on the very same stretch of road, and they jumped the fence and went to have a picnic. He casually revealed to her that he had killed someone, and that he had the urge again and had picked her to be his next victim. He made her sit and eat dinner after being told that she was going to be very violently killed soon after. He seemed to delight in the terror he instilled, and kept telling her what he was going to do. Sure enough, after dinner, he did those things and then killed himself too. The girl held on just long enough for the police to get there and die while telling them not to trust him and to be careful of him. She obviously had no idea that he was already dead, and she wanted to warn them." Next story. My story is a bit unusual. I knew that there was something wrong with my house when I first moved in, only a few days before the famous Hurricane Andrew. The day after the hurricane, I felt a strange presence walking into my parents' bedroom. The feeling was an unusual coldness in the area before the actual bedroom. The few days without light on my neighborhood, my grandmother said she would see a man watching us by the trees in my backyard. She would even see the strange spirit walking into the house as she would be drinking her chicken soup. My English teacher was the one who actually lived in the house before me. His name was Mr. Dennis. He wanted us to tell him about our hurricane experience and how we dealt with it. After I was done with my story, he had to talk to me about what happened. He told me that he would see the same spirit walking around the house at the time he lived there. He said the person that actually haunted the place was a doctor that once lived in the house when it was first built. His name was Edward, a doctor at a local clinic. He looked back at the newspapers from that year and it stated that he was murdered by his secret lover, a cross-dresser prostitute named Stefan or Steve Viatoro. My teacher read that the prostitute went home with him and killed him out of jealousy. The place where he actually died was in the same place I always get chills when I walk by. I do not know why, but my grandmother is the only one that can see a silhouette around the house, and when she looks out of the window into the backyard, there he is staring back. Next story. For a very short time, several years ago, I dated a Russian pilot named Mikhail. Mikhail had moved here about 6 months before I met him, and it turned out he had come here illegally and was looking for a green card. I really enjoyed his company. He was fun, he was cute, he was intelligent. Often on weekends we would go out to an airstrip where he knew several guys who had planes, and he would ask if he could borrow one to take me up. I still have, a tremendous fear of flying, so I was always relieved because none of the guys would let us borrow a plane. I think Mikhail thought he could cure my fear if he could take me up, but it never worked out. He did, though, constantly assure me that statistically flying was safer than driving, probably even safer than walking, and I would argue that he was nuts. As much as I liked him, the green card thing and some other circumstances broke us up after a couple of months. I found out from a mutual friend that only 4 or 5 months later Mikael had married and settled down. I truly was happy for him. Another 3 or 4 months passed. I picked up the phone one Monday to hear our mutual friend say, "Did you hear what happened to Mikael?" It turned out that he had died in a plane crash the previous Saturday. He and another pilot had taken up some old plane and crashed mere seconds later. Both died immediately. I honestly don't remember how soon it started, if it was that same day or within the next couple of days, but when I would come home from work, the lights in the apartment would flash wherever I was. Then the downstairs TV went on the fritz. Actually, it worked fine. It just kept turning itself off. I asked the complex management to send someone out to look at my wiring. They said it was just power surges and not to worry about it. After another day or two, I asked my next door neighbor if she was experiencing any power surges, and she said no. I told her about Mikael and jokingly asked if she thought I had company. She said, well, he was 36, newlywed, had everything to live for, and died completely unexpectedly. He wasn't ready to go. Meanwhile, the lights and TV kept up their antics. I complained again to the complex, but they still wouldn't send anybody. So illogically, I called the cable company thinking that if they hooked up cable, the TV would be okay. The strangest thing occurred one night when I woke up in the middle of the night to see the upstairs TV turning itself off and on, and the oscillating fan next to the bed doing the same. I got up, unplugged the fan and the TV, and went right back to sleep. Oh, and I think I yelled into the air something like, "Knock it off, Misha." All of this continued until the following Monday, when the illogically, miraculously cable guy came. He hooked up both TVs at about 10 o'clock that Monday morning, and I never had another electrical problem after that. Was it just a coincidence that Mikael was buried at 10 that Monday morning? Why wait so long for a burial, you ask? His family had to make arrangements to come here from Russia. Why in the hell didn't he haunt his wife? I don't know. Maybe he did. Or maybe he still had some nice feelings left over for me. Next story. For quite a few nights, I'd been hearing this noise in the attic, right above me. I was scared at first, because I had always believed in ghosts and stuff, and I do get excited about them, but when I started making up the fact that there might be one under my bed or in my closet, I started scaring myself. So, I was scared. Let me tell you what the noise sounded like. It was different. It sounded like someone or something was walking around up there. But there was a kind of noise that sounded like a mixture of a fighting cat and a horse whinnying. I know you can't imagine what that sounds like right now, but if you heard it, I'm sure you'd describe it in the same way. Anyway, one night, I had stayed up late to watch Saturday Night Live, and I heard it, and decided to go see what it was. So I went out to the garage and stood at the entrance to the attic. The noise grew louder, and it sounded like it was running towards the attic door, so I chickened out of going inside the attic to investigate. Hey, don't laugh at me. You would have chickened out too if you were in my position. I tried to tell my parents about it, but they didn't care. They never do, but that's a different story. I've been telling my best friend about the noise in the attic since it started happening, since I first heard it. So I told her about how I planned to check it out, and then how I chickened out and she wanted to come over to my house and go into the attic with me. I was still scared, and I tried to go in there again, but since my best friend would be with me, I thought it sounded like a good idea. So I listened to the noise for another whole week, and then she stayed the night at my house that weekend. We waited until my parents were asleep, and then we waited to hear the noise. And we waited, and waited, and waited. And we never heard the noise. We did hear my sister and parents' snores, but nothing else. We fell asleep trying to listen for it. My best friend was very disappointed when she had to leave the next day. I heard it the night after that, but I wasn't going to go up to the attic again by myself, so I did nothing. My best friend stayed the night at my house, every time she possibly could. But we still didn't hear it. I don't know why, but every time she was at my house, we wouldn't hear it. So, summer vacation came, and my best friend had been trying to listen for the noise for about 3 months, and she still hadn't heard it. Well, since school was out, she started staying at my house more often. Then her parents went on vacation, and she was staying at my house for a whole 2 weeks. We were excited about that, not just because of the ghost listening, because of other reasons. We were best friends and we loved spending time together. At the end of the first week, we fell asleep listening for it, again. I guess the ghost or whatever got used to her being at my house so much and started to accept her or something, because on the 8th day of her being at my house, she woke me up panting and sweating really hard. Her face was as pale as could be. "What's that noise?" she asked me, more frightened and stiff than a deer in headlights. I listened. I didn't have to listen very hard since the noise was so loud. And I heard it. The noise. We were both so frightened from being woken up in the middle of the night by that thing in the attic that we were way too scared to go into the attic now. So we both listened to the noise for 3 more nights, frightened as I don't know what. Then finally my best friend said, "I want to see what it is." "What is up in your attic?" I said, "Okay, you go up there by yourself and check it out." No, I'm just kidding. I went to the garage together and opened the little pull-down door thingy, and the ladder slid out. We weren't as scared as I was when I went there by myself, because it didn't sound like it was heading right towards us. When we went to go up the stairs, the noise stopped, because we could still hear it. I went up first since it was my attic, and I knew where the light switch was and all. My best friend decided that for me. I had my hands behind my back and was clutching her hand very tightly, and I walked quickly, but quietly, to the light switch. I turned it on, and we both looked around, and we saw nothing. There was nothing in the room. We looked everywhere, and we were up in that attic for over an hour looking. The next night we decided that we would have a seance, so we got white candles and a Ouija board, and we had a seance. We told the thing up there that we were frightened and that we wanted it to go away. I guess we were too rough, because the light bulb burst and everything went pitch black. Me and my best friend hauled out of there as fast as we could, and every night since then, I heard that noise in the attic. We moved out of my house less than a year after that, but it was scary while it lasted. I don't know if my parents or sisters ever heard that noise in the attic, but me and my best friend sure did. This all happened over 4 years ago. The house that I used to live in when that happened, it burnt down a little over a year ago. The fire started in the attic. Next story. The incident I'm about to explain was told to me by my aunt. My aunt had just divorced and moved to a town in New Hampshire, not too far from where I lived at that time. She had with her her daughter, who was probably about 3 at the time. They moved into a nice apartment and had friendly neighbors who all looked out for one another's place or children. Not long after my aunt moved in, she started to experience odd things. She had her own thermostat in the apartment, and whenever she left, she would turn it down. When she would return, she would find her apartment very hot. When she checked the thermostat, it was cranked. After turning it down again, she went across the hall and asked her neighbor if she saw anyone go into her apartment, which actually would have been impossible since she had the only key. Her neighbor said someone was definitely in there because she heard loud footsteps in the apartment, but she didn't see anyone enter or leave. My aunt found this strange, and when she entered her apartment, the thermostat was again cranked. She knew her daughter didn't do it because she was right next to her. Sometimes she would leave her windows open a crack when she left to go somewhere. When she returned, the windows would be closed and locked. Again, her neighbor reported hearing footsteps, but not seeing anyone enter or leave. After a while, the window and thermostat business stopped. Just when my aunt thought that whatever had been happening had stopped, worse things would happen. She would return home and find her plants knocked over and her dishes on the floor, cracked or broken. Astonished, she asked the neighbor if she heard anything in her apartment. This time the neighbor didn't hear a sound. The final straw happened not long after, when my aunt left my cousin alone in the apartment for a few minutes to run down to the lobby and check her mail. She didn't lock the door when she left, but when she arrived at her door, she found it locked. She called to her daughter to unlock the door, and she answered that the door wasn't locked. Terrified that her daughter was in danger, she ran to the neighbors to use the phone, but the phone was out of order. So in the freezing cold of winter, she had to run across the street to a payphone, not wearing any shoes. She called the fire department to go knock the door down. Then she ran back to her apartment and checked the door, which was still locked. When the fire department got there, they checked the door to see if it was still locked. Amazingly enough, it wasn't. They opened the door and let her in, apparently thinking she was crazy. That night, she lit some candles and tried a seance. She asked that whoever was in there to please leave her things and daughter alone. She didn't care if he or she stayed, but they had to respect her property. If they respected her, she would respect them. Surprisingly enough, this worked. My aunt said that from then until the time they moved out a month later, that the ghost never did anything harmful to her apartment again. About as far as it went was if the windows were left open during a rainstorm, they would be closed. All's well that ends well, I suppose.